This video is going to cover P1, which is the first review section from the prereq chapter of the calculus book. So we start out with basic questions like the ones in this section, which are just solving equations. You want to solve equations with fractions or with decimal points. Something like 22, you would multiply everything by 10 to get rid of the fraction. And then something like 24, you would count the decimals behind, or count the digits behind the decimal, which there's 2, but the second one is 0. So really I could get away with multiplying everything in that row, in that equation by 10 and eliminate my decimals and then solve it. When you get to ones like these say solve the equation, check your solution. And then if it's not possible, explain why. So in something like 27, we could just multiply everything by 12 and solve it. Something like 28 is where you would want to check your answer, because if y is 0, you can't plug 0 into the denominator, which is one of the situations when you would have to check and rule something out. When you get to a question like 29, something like 5x minus 4 over 5x plus 4 equals 2/3. I've got one fraction on either side of the equal sign, so I can simply just cross multiply. When you get to 35, now we're dealing with rational equations here. So 35, I would want to take my denominator. So if 35 is 3 over x squared minus 3x plus 4 over x equals 1 over x minus 3, I would want to factor out the x here. And then when I go to multiply by the least common denominator, it's going to be, if I look at all the denominators, what each of them go into. So it would be x and then also x minus 3. So I'd multiply each individual fraction by that. The first fraction it's going to cancel from. The second one I would cancel out the x, but I'd keep the x minus 3. And the last one I'd have the x. So I'd end up with 3 plus 4x minus 3 equals x, and then I would distribute and solve it just like my normal equation. Same thing's going to happen for 36. I would want to again factor it, find the least common denominator, and then multiply everything by it to get rid of the fractions. When you look at 37, something like this would have to be expanded, multiplied, and then combine your like terms. So this is going to be x plus 2 times x plus 2. And then I would expand and FOIL that, plus 5 equals, and then x plus 3 times x plus 3. And the other side, again, expand and FOIL that out. And then combine your like terms and solve it. When you get to 57, 63, and 62, this is where you want to remember your even root property. So if I had something like, let's say I have 58, so 9x squared equals 36. I could divide both sides by 9, and I'd get x squared equals 4, and then square equals plus and minus the square root of 4. So that's the most important thing to remember here is the plus and minus. When you get to something like 61, 62, 63, so let's do 61, x plus 2 squared equals 14. X plus 2 would equal plus and minus the square root of 14, and then subtract that 2, and I'd get negative 2 plus and minus the square root of 14. If 14 could be broken down into something other than, this is 2 and 7, so there's nothing repeating, then I would make sure to break that down as well. The last section on this, or the last group on this section is solving by completing the squares. So hopefully by now with all of our conics practice, you're pretty good at completing the square. Remember, group together the first two terms, bump the other one to the other side. If there's something in front of the x squared, take it out. And then find your middle term by taking the middle, find your third term by taking the middle term, dividing it by 2, squaring it, and adding it inside the parentheses, and then multiplying it by what's on the outside before you add it to the other side of the equal sign. So that would be like 73 and 76. All right, the next section is also solving a quadratic equation, but this time doing the quadratic formula. So for 83, 85, and 89, I would get x equals negative b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2 times a. Identify your a, your b, your c, and then take it and plug it in. When you get to 105 to 118, it says find all the real solutions of the equation. Check your answers in the original equation. So the first thing, notice it says real solutions, so you're not taking into consideration any i's. And most of these you're either factoring by grouping. So if I did, I'll work out 111 since that's similar to 112. So 4 terms, I want to factor by grouping. Take out my x squared here. I get x minus 3. A negative 1, I get x minus 3. And x minus 3 repeats, so pull that out. X squared minus 1, and this becomes x minus 3, x plus 1, x minus 1. So I'd get 3, negative 1, and 3. And then it just said to check it by taking it, plugging back in. So that would be something similar to 112. Again, group your terms. For 114, I'd combine my like terms first. And then 115 is factoring. So x to the 4th minus 4x squared plus 3. You're factoring for the factors of the last term that sum to the middle, but instead of the first term both being x, these are x squared. But then everything else is the same after that. All right, for 119 to 144, it says find all the solutions of the equation. Check your answers in the, or solutions in the original equation. So when you're dealing with something like, let's say 121 or 123, because those are similar. So 121, square root of x minus 10 minus 4 equals 0. I'd add the 4 to the other side. And then to solve it, I'd square both sides. So x minus 10 equals 16, and x would equal 26. And then these are the ones you want to make sure you check. So if I took that and plug it back in here, 26 minus 10 is 16. Square root of 16 is 4. 4 minus 4 is 0. If you end up with 2 answers and one works and one doesn't work, you just rule out the one that doesn't work. For something like 25, it's now the cube root. So I would move the 8 to the other side and cube both sides of the equation. For 127, when you square both sides of the equation, after you move the 4 to the other side, you'd be actually expanding and foiling this side. And then looking at 129, so if I'm raising something to the 3 halves, this is the same thing as saying x minus 6, or the square root of x minus 6 raised to the 3rd power. So you can either individually find, so I would cube root both sides of the equation to get rid of the 3, and then square both sides of the equation to get rid of the root, or you can simply do the reciprocal of this. So if it's x minus 6 to the 3 halves, then I'd actually be raising it to the 2/3 on both sides. So these are going to cancel, and I get x minus 6 equals, the 3 slides over to become the index. So this is the cube root of 8 squared. So when I convert from exponential, in which there's a fraction, the number on the bottom, or the denominator of the fraction, would become the index, or the root, on my square root. And then the exponent would become, and then the top, would become the exponent. And then from here, I'd cube root 8, making it 2. 2 squared is 4. And then solve it from there. So if you were to look at 131, I'd get x plus 3 to the 2/3 equals 5. So I, again, would be flipping it so that it becomes 3 halves. And I'd raise this to the 3 halves. And I'd get x plus 3 equals the square root of 5 cubed. And then I would add or subtract the 3 from the other side. So x would equal, the square root of 5 cubed would be square root of 5 times square root of 5 times square root of 5, or 5 root 3 minus 3. When you get to 139 and 140, these are both absolute values. So if you remember absolute value, you would take whatever's inside the absolute value and set it equal to what's there, but also the negative version of that number. Because if what's in here is a -5, the absolute value makes it +5. So I would get 2 answers for each of these. Same thing for 140. set it equal to both positive 12 and negative 12. And that's the end of the P.1 problem. So you want to do all the ones that are highlighted, and the odds, don't forget, you can check using the Calc Chat link that's on, which is most of them are the odds. You can check the Calc Chat link that's on the module.